Our third and final heading is down to service. So we've seen straight to Jerusalem, up to honor, and now down to service. Look with me, if you will, at verses 41 down through 45. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. And Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So Jesus answers James and John, and the other 10 were either standing by and heard this, or somehow word got back to them that James and John made this request, and they were not happy about it. Things got tense, and I imagine some kind of rebuke ensued, and they were trying to make James and John feel ashamed for having asked something like that. I don't think it was because they were humble, the other 10 disciples, but probably because of their continued rivalry. You know that they were arguing over who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. That's already come up in the gospel. And here they are, probably just out of jealousy and rivalry and trying to outmaneuver each other. They almost felt like James and John were going to get positions that maybe they were all vying for. Regardless, Jesus, once again, overhearing them, decides that this is a teaching moment, and so he calls them together. He forms a little huddle with the 12, and he needs to give them some instruction that is not only important for them right then and there to give them perspective, but it was going to be instruction and perspective for after he left this earth and they were charged with building and governing and leading the church after its birth. So now notice the language and notice the lesson that Jesus is going to bring to the disciples. He doesn't want them to have mentalities of masters. He wants them to have mentalities of servants. And so he gives them a negative example to start with. He says, don't be like the Gentiles. And then he concludes the lesson with a positive example, himself. So a good way to break up Jesus' lesson here is in 3 points. Be small, be a servant, and be self-sacrificing. Be small, be a servant, and be self-sacrificing. Notice what verse 42 says, where Jesus says, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." Now, the wording in the Greek literally means there, when it says lord it over them, to play the tyrant. And conveyed in that idea is just an arrogant person who sees themselves as superior to those whom they are governing, and those whom they are governing are there as their own personal subjects. They're to be exploited. You're to extract everything you can from them and to give nothing in return. It's not governing out of consideration for the well-being of those you rule over. It's you're in a position of governing, and it's now what you can get and how you can get the most advantage as a result of that. And so Jesus is holding up the Gentiles as an example, a negative example for the apostles. Don't be like them. You see, that's how Gentiles govern Gentiles. That's how they are with their own kind, but not Christians. That's not how Christians are with each other. I asked myself the question, why is he using the Gentile rulers as an example and not the Jewish rulers? I mean, Jesus hasn't been shy in his criticism of the Jewish rulers, the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and so forth. He has been fiercely critical of them. Why wouldn't he use them as the negative example here? And I think this is the reason why. Not because the Pharisees were poor examples of leadership, which they were, and not because the Sanhedrin and the chief priests and teachers of the law weren't poor examples of leadership for those who would be leaders in the church. By all means, they were horrible examples, but there was something deeper in a Jew's psyche that Jesus was tapping into. Gentiles were dogs to Jews. Gentiles were unclean. Gentiles were separated from God. They weren't on the in like Jews were. They were on the out. They were defiled, and you were supposed to avoid them at all costs. So when Jesus chose for his apostles in this lesson to use the Gentiles as an example, he wanted to conjure up in them all that disgust that they had resident inside them for Gentiles. Not to hate the Gentiles, but he wanted to conjure up that disgust for Gentiles and then channel it to the practices of the Gentiles. He wanted them to connect that disgust with the way they ruled over their people. As followers of Christ and apostles of Christ, they are not in any way to let their leadership in the church look the way that it looks, the way that rulership looks in the Gentile world. That's disgusting. That's defiled. That's repulsive. And that's what Jesus is doing here, I think, when he uses the Gentiles in this example rather than using the Jewish leaders. Now, he wanted them to feel that way because perhaps that kind of lording it over and playing the tyrant over Christians is that repulsive to him. And he would not be happy with any of his church leaders leading in such a way, in such an un-Christ-like way. So anyway, so what we've got here is we've got a negative example in the Gentile rulers that Jesus says. So be small in your own eyes. Don't allow your position of leadership and authority in the church to puff you up and make you think you're some big shot. No, you need to be small, as we've referred to in the past with the first king of Israel, Saul, when God said, you once were small in your own eyes. Every church leader, pastor, every elder needs to have a mentality of being small in his own eyes and not have this puffed up view. The second thing Jesus says is to be a servant. Notice what he says in verses 43 and 44. Not so with you. In other words, don't be like the Gentile rulers. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Jesus is really driving home the idea of humility in those who are going to follow him and those who are going to be appointed as leaders in the church. And pride was the issue at hand because James and John came to Jesus with these prideful notions of self-exaltation. They wanted to have these high places of honor and glory, and Jesus was bringing them down, first of all, by describing to them the necessity of suffering to precede that kind of glory. But now Jesus is talking to them about their mentality, not seeing themselves as masters, but seeing themselves as servants and slaves. And those are two key words that Jesus uses, the word servant and the word slave. The word servant is the Greek word diakonos. The word diakonos, when it's used in a general way, just refers to someone who helps, someone who gives assistance, someone who gives aid, someone, often it's used as a table waiter. It's just someone who's there to attend to the needs of others. Used in its technical sense, it refers to someone in the church who holds the position of deacon. And the role of deacon in a church is that of a helper, that of a servant, that of someone who gives assistance. Well, to who? Well, to the church, but specifically to the pastor or pastors as they are carrying out the role of leading in the church. They help and enable the pastor to be able to do that. So it's a helper. The word deacon, diakonos in the Greek, is there referring to someone who helps. They give benefit. Their work is a benefit to the people that they're working for. And then the word slave is doulos, which literally means slave. It's someone who has a master who is subject to a master and to obey their master. And that is a profoundly humble perspective for someone who's in leadership, because power corrupts. Power corrupts our self image, and it puffs us up and makes us think we're far more than what we are when we get a little bit of power. And the antidote to that is what Jesus says here. And the ethic in the church is what Jesus says here, that no, a church leader and a Christian by extension, all Christians, are to have these humble perspectives of themselves and not allowed to have ideas of themselves that where others are servants and slaves to us, but we are to have a self-image where we are slaves to everyone else, and we are to meet the needs of everyone else in our service. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Be a servant, not seeing others as our servants, but seeing ourselves as the servants to all. And this fits really in line with Paul's teachings by extension later in, like, say, Philippians chapter 2, when he says, honor others above yourselves. Think about that. Think about the person that you look down on constantly, maybe perhaps a spouse, maybe perhaps a relative, somebody in church where you're constantly critical of them. Can you reverse your mentality to see that person as better than yourself, as honoring them, as seeing them more honorable than yourself? That's what Jesus is saying to do here. So Jesus is really challenging the pride that is in all of us. And if you're going to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and you're going to be a sincere disciple of Jesus Christ, you've got to deal with your pride. And that means humbling down and having an image of your status no higher than that of a slave who's only worthy to untie the sandals of guests as they come into the home. That is the mindset Jesus wants his followers to have. And then the third point that Jesus makes is be self-sacrificing. So be small, be a servant, and be self-sacrificing. And the key is in verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Self-sacrificing. Jesus, as the Son of Man, came to serve, not to be served, but to serve. His whole life was dedicated in service to others. Think about all the miracles that he did. Think of how he served people with his power, with his time, with his love, with his wisdom through his teachings, his power through his healings. People's lives were better because Jesus came. And that's the key that Jesus is driving home to the disciples. That when he sends them and they go, when they go to people, other people's lives should be better because of them, because of the wisdom of the teachings they will bring, because they've been learning from Jesus, and because of the power that Jesus was going to send them with to be able to continue that miraculous ministry that he began, and he's going to continue it through them. So they would heal people, they would teach people, and they would give people the good news so that people could hear how to be saved. So let's just look at this verse here a second, because it's so crucial. It says, for the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve. And so again, here is the mentality of a person that their life is not to be lived for themselves alone, but their life is lived for others, in service to others. That's a hard mentality to have, because we live lives of acquisition, where we are constantly trying to acquire for ourselves. We are constantly looking for how we can make our lives better, how we can serve our interests and our wants and our desires. But Jesus says, he comes along and he says, no, the life of a servant of Christ is a life that is in service to all. And so he says that, and then not only in his living did he serve, but then he finishes the verse referencing his death as a service to all. He says, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is referring to his death, that in his death, his very death was going to be an act of service for mankind. Think about this. Jesus was going to do something for us in his death that none of us could do for each other and none of us could do for ourselves. You see, in his death, Jesus was going to pay the penalty for all of our sins, take away our guilt for our sins. He was going to free us from the bondage of sin and death and give us everlasting life. And the key word to key in on is the word ransom. And that word in the Greek was in reference to the price that was paid to free a slave. So just imagine you lived back in the Roman Empire where over a third of the population was actually slaves. And imagine that you were free, but yet your cousin was a slave, and you had come into some money, and you had enough money to be able to pay for your cousin's freedom. And so you would go to your cousin's master and you would sit down with him and you would negotiate a ransom price. And that price that he would accept would be the price to free your cousin from bondage to him and being a slave to him. And so your cousin would be free as a free citizen in Rome, or excuse me, would be free in Rome and would be no man's slave because you came along and you paid the price. You delivered him out of slavery by the price that you paid that he couldn't pay himself. That's the picture that Jesus is conveying when he says that the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' own life was forfeited intentionally, on purpose, as a plan to liberate us sinners from sin and death, so that sin and death were no longer masters over us, but now we were free from sin and death. And ironically, now pay attention here, ironically, Jesus says, now that we are free from sin and death and no longer slaves, we are to adopt the mentality of slaves when we enter into service for Christ. You see, we are not actually slaves to sin and death anymore, but we have a new master now, and we are slaves to righteousness, and we are slaves to Christ. And we, as slaves to Christ, in service to him, out of gratitude for our freedom, now go and serve others as an act of serving him. That's what Jesus is getting at here, is that humble mentality. And again, Jesus says, don't be like Gentiles who view themselves as masters, but view yourselves as servants and slaves, and look to me as your example. I came not to be served, but to serve. I had a mentality of a servant. I had the mentality of someone who dedicated his life to be the lowest of everyone in service to everyone. And again, I reference back to Philippians chapter 2, where Paul says this. Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. Listen, taking the very nature of a servant. Christians, application number one for us is this: we are servants. There's no room for the pride and the ego of masters. There's no room for masters in the Christian life. We are servants. Application number two: if you are not a Christian today, can you see the love that the humble Son of Man has for you? That he came down from his glory, he set it all aside, and he subjected himself to the most horrific, unjust mistreatment that anyone could ever experience. And he shed his blood for you. He did for you what you could never do for yourself. You can't save yourself. Only Jesus can save you. And that is why he came. He came for you, that you would be ransomed. Perhaps all these things I'm trying to say can't be said any better than the way Charles Wesley said it in his great hymn, And Can It Be? He said in about the fourth verse these words: Long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound in sin and nature's night. Thine eye diffused a quickening ray. I woke, the dungeon flamed with light. My chains fell off, my heart was free. I rose and went forth and followed thee. Those are great words, aren't they? It's only a great hymn to sing if you yourself have been set free and if the chains have fallen off your wrists and your ankles, that your heart, which has long been imprisoned, has been liberated by the love of Jesus. But all it takes from you is one look to Jesus. All it takes is for you right now to look to him in faith and to put your trust in him as your Savior. And if you do that, your chains will fall off. Your heart will be free. You will be enabled to rise, to go forth, and to follow he.